Biocare Lifesciences Incorporated is a pharmaceutical company engaged in the distribution, importation, registration, and marketing of various therapeutic products across the Philippines. We at Biocare commit ourselves to service excellence in the promotion and delivery of essential as well as technologically advanced medical products that are within reach of the average Filipino. We pride ourselves in our company core values: punctuality, integrity, commitment, accountability, and this reflects on our service. Our vision is to play a significant role among the pharmaceutical companies in the Philippines, delivering high-quality yet affordable products and services that improve the quality of the Filipino lives it touches. We are dedicated to our mission to be among the top market leaders in our chosen segments by providing qualitative and affordable medicines to the community and year-to-year growth of employees and stakeholders, as well as to develop a young, talented, and experienced workforce. In 2011, Biocare Lifesciences Incorporated was founded by Managing Director Dilip Tiwari and President Kimberly Chua Tiwari. By 2012, we started the distribution of our products to numerous multinational and national companies. In 2013, Biocare registered over 23 products for different segments, and by 2015, we expanded our staff, deploying our new sales force to 17 areas in Central Luzon, South Luzon, and the Visayas region. In 2016, the expansion of the sales force and marketing team continues to the Greater Manila area, Visayas, and North Luzon, and we've moved to the new HQ with a complete rebrand. By 2017, we successfully launched Cefsul, a combination of third-generation cephalosporins and beta-lactamase inhibitor antibiotic. Now, Biocare expands to Cambodia and launched our first inhaler line with salmeterol fluticasone, Salflosol MDI, and Highcare, brand of salbutamol. Biocare has products from reputed pharmaceutical manufacturers around the world whose facilities are approved by various regulatory boards. And Biocare hasn't even reached its full potential. In 7 years, we've only laid a foundation. Soon, we'll strengthen our reach to the Mindanao region and eventually spread to the whole Asia-Pacific region with a culture of leadership and accountability. Looking forward, we want Biocare to be a corporation that you can always trust. Providing quality, defining life.
Good evening, doctors. I am Pauline Espiritu from MedConcept, and I will be your host for this live webinar. But before we begin the program, please join me for a moment of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, the fount of all goodness and grace, the cause of wisdom, the source of intelligence, we welcome you, O Lord, to this gathering of healthcare professionals. We give you thanks for every opportunity to learn something new and become fruitful to the works of your creation. We pray that tonight's gathering, made possible by the grace of advancements in technology, becomes successful. May we find wisdom in this session so we may be instruments of your compassion and healing love. This we pray in your name. Amen. A warm welcome to all the doctors who have joined us tonight. To formally open this forum, let us welcome the Business Unit Head for Biocare Lifesciences, Mr. Ronald Palacio.
Thank you, Pauline. So, good evening to our dear doctors. As country continues across the world, the rolling of their vaccination program to prevent the coronavirus and achieve the herd immunity, scientists continue to work on developing treatment for the disease. Regulatory agencies around the world are assessing the use of monoclonal antibodies as therapy to treat COVID-19. Those with mild to moderate COVID-19 who are at high risk of developing severe disease. So there are data showing that early treatment with monoclonal antibodies can reduce the risk of disease progressions. After we successfully launched the COVID-19 medicines last year, Biocare has several new products in its pipeline, thanks to our business development staff and well-equipped regulatory department. And most important, our sincerest gratitude to you, our dear doctors and healthcare partners, for supporting and trusting Biocare Lifesciences brand of COVID-19 medicines. This is our commitment to have a contribution in the improvement of nation's health, especially this time. We are excited in bringing TOCI tocilizumab in the country. This is another milestone for our company. So on behalf of our Managing Director, Mr. Dilip Tiwari, we are particularly pleased with this partnership that has come to us, and we assure the healthcare practitioners with a high standard quality of TOCI. Arogen is known for producing several biopharmaceutical brands for vitals, saving lives of many patients. Launching high-quality, affordable biosimilars serve as a new possibility for treatment of people who have not already had access to this life-saving medicine. With this development, the shortage in supplies coming from the original brand will somehow address, as Temsiba would be available in the country. We in Biocare Life Sciences also commit to be in the foremost of delivering medical updates amidst the pandemic. We thank you for accepting our invitation to attend this live webinar. Without much ado, let me introduce our moderator, Dr. Ralph Villalobos. Obtained his medical degree from the University of the Philippines. He took his residency training in internal medicine as well as his fellowship training in pulmonary medicine in the same institution. Our moderator had further training in interventional pulmonology at the China Medical University Hospitals, a fellow of Philippine College of Physicians and the Philippine College of Chest Physicians. Let us welcome Dr. Ralph Villalobos.
Good evening, and thank you, Sir Ronald, for the invitation to moderate this session. So, before we begin the lecture, I would like to direct your attention to the question box that you will find in your control panel. So please look for it now. If in the course of the talk a question comes to your mind, you can write them down and press submit so we can have our guest speaker answer them during the question and answer segment. Okay, on that note, now, I'm sure we're all excited for this lecture. I know a lot of us have questions on tocilizumab. I'll now introduce our speaker for tonight. He's one of my mentor that I really look upon in the College of Medicine. So Dr. Gilbert Benedicto is an associate professor at the University of the Philippines College of Medicine. He's the chair for the Critical Care Unit Management Team and the vice chair for Patient Services of the Department of Medicine at UPPGH. Our speaker is likewise the head of Public Health and Domiciliary Unit at the Lung Center of the Philippines. He was the former Chief Resident and Chief Fellow at the UPPGH Department of Medicine Division of Pulmonology. He's a fellow of the Philippine College of Physicians, the Philippine College of Chest Physicians, and the American College of Chest Physicians. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear doctors, colleagues, join me in welcoming Dr. Jubert Benedicto.
Thank you very much and good evening to everyone. Good evening, Ralph. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. So if I can have my slides. So in the next few minutes, this is going to be quite an informal talk. I mean, let's have an informal atmosphere, in which case all questions we will try to answer. And basically, it will involve tocilizumab, of course, looking specifically at what the study is telling us in terms of outcomes. And may I say, let's concentrate on hard outcomes. And of course, considering everything, what will be the clinical implications? How will we interpret all these things? That's why that's clinical insights. So basically, those will be my main objectives to give you a rationale, a background of what tocilizumab is. Let's just revisit the molecule and of course its touted action, and specifically using that as a springboard, looking at what the studies are telling us. Is the touted action really exhibited or demonstrated by these key studies? I think that's a very relevant question. And we will be looking at specifically landmark trials that made the backbone in terms of recommendation, and finishing up with all these things in terms of how will we apply it, in terms of how will it imply in terms of our approach to COVID-19. So this is just my disclosure slide, of course, highlighting that in the next few minutes, the perspectives that I will be sharing with you is from my appreciation as a pulmonary intensivist in terms of the literature, and in terms of a frontliner, just like you, my colleagues, in terms of how will we apply this tocilizumab. So this is the typical COVID clinical course. We know this, that in a majority of instances, these patients are asymptomatic, but unfortunately, really, some of them will become, of course, severe to critical. Once they go to the moderate stage, they should be admitted. I would just like to highlight that majority of them will have, of course, this early infection, flu-like symptom. Unfortunately, a big chunk or a significant chunk will progress to some pulmonary phase of the disease, characterized mainly as hypoxemia, shortness of breath, and of course, when they go into that cytokine storm, that hyperinflammatory response, yun yung nakakabanas. That's the one that's associated with dire outcomes in terms of this disease. And consistently end organ damage, which translates, of course, to mortality or morbidity. That said, if we're going to look at studies on cytokine storm, it is really explicit in trying to tell us that, it's not just the lungs that are affected. We do know that during the cytokine storm phase or the hyperinflammatory phase, dun po natin nakikita yung pneumonia, ARDS, manifesting as hypoxemia, and of course, the patient really becoming shortness of breath. But remember, that cytokine storm can also present initially with fever, fatigue, quote unquote, flu-like symptom. And definitely, once you have that stormy phase as well, it tends to overflow. The inflammatory cascade, it's not just confined to one compartment of the body. Nandun din po, maskin vascular and lymphatic systems. And therefore, we do know that COVID is quite consistently associated with the hypercoagulable state. That said, if you're going to look at specifically the lungs, we do know that because of this interaction between the inflammatory cells and of course the lung structure, and of course the body's attempts to try to, limit this infection, ano pong nangyayari? Well, unfortunately, because of all those things, you have a chaotic microenvironment in the lung, and that will result, in really a good battleground for all this inflammatory response going in auri, and of course them becoming beyond the control mechanisms of the body, and they tend to recruit a lot of inflammatory cells. So that will translate into something like an ARDS-like illness, and yun po ang nagpapaproblema sa mga pulmonologists. Just remember again, if we're going to look at the cellular responses of the body during this cytokine storm phase, quite consistently, we are told that this cytokine storm phase, if unabated, is the one which is associated with multi-organ failure and death. But if you're going to look at how it interacts at the cellular level, we do note that there's a lot of culprit. Nandun po yung tumor necrosis factor. Nandun yung interleukin 1. Nandun yung interleukin 6. And a lot of other cytokines. That said, of course, this tends to activate your complement pathway. It tends to, of course, activate all these signaling pathways that leads to a chaotic inflammatory environment. And as I've mentioned, that's the one that leads to death. Yes, there's a lot of possible agent, as what this diagram will show you, in terms of trying to halt specifically yung nasa taas po, no? The upstream, no? And then, of course, we do know that tocilizumab will try to do that, try to abort that cytokine storm phase, or at least dampen that inflammatory response by specifically acting on interleukin 6. Your steroid, of course, works here sa medyo downstream in trying to, halt all of this. So just by looking at this disease framework, if you can possibly halt this inflammatory response earlier on, then the possibility, of course, of you preventing multi-organ failure and death is there. What more if you're going to combine it with your glucocorticoid? Because specifically, if you're going to combine it with your glucocorticoid, baka po mas powerful, no, yung response natin in terms of aborting death.
Okay, so let's now look at IL-6 actions, IL-6 interleukin 6 actions. And we do know that quite succinctly, you will see from this diagram that it tends to increase certain things, no? Ang ayaw po natin yan po, no? Fibrin formation, neutrophil activation, cytokine release, and of course your angiotensin 2. And then it tends to reduce other responses, your lymphocytes. Kaya po tayo may lymphopenia. Your other things such as your infected cell apoptosis. Bottom line, pati po yung viral clearance is becoming reduced. All of those things come into play. And basically, ang sinasabi po quite consistently by lab stats, we have to abort those things. So if you have an agent, an IL-6 antibody, whose main action is on the IL-6 receptors, then you can see quite rationally, if you have that agent, you can abort this particular side of the processes, and therefore you now dampen or you prevent the catastrophic consequences of this cytokine storm. And then the possibility again of having good outcomes is consistently there. But having said that, ito po yung framework ng tocilizumab. We don't like the inflammatory storm. We would like to calm that storm by introducing this agent. Having said that, as I've mentioned, let's look at, let's take a step back. Ano po ba yung setting sa atin sa ngayon? Well, this is from a Philippine hospital. So as you can see, during surges, we are really flocked by a lot of sick patients needing oxygen support. So ano pa ang nakikita natin? We are facing with a rapidly evolving knowledge on a disease that we do not completely know. Napakatalino po nitong COVID. Sometimes we tend to say na nakukuha na natin yung kung paano mag-respond. But then again, 2 weeks later, bakit parang nag-deviate yung patient ko sa typical response? We do know that there's a huge demand for therapies that work, not necessarily work 100%, kahit na may positive signals. Remember during surges, di ba? Yun ang gusto natin. May clinical pathways tayo, nilalamp natin yung mga agents that do work, and hopefully protocolize yung approach natin sa mga patients. We want to insist on well-defined studies, but definitely this may be challenging, if not impossible, for certain agents, because the clinician is there at the crux of everything, trying to make sense of all these things. Okay, This is a review of all 2020 studies looking at tocilizumab and mortality. So as you can see, quite consistently in terms of effect of tocilizumab versus standard of care. The standard of care there, yes, it varies from center to center. And as I will tell you specifically, dahil po may heterogeneity, we have to treat that. But look at that quite consistent message that it does affect mortality. It does says that it has mortality benefits. But as I've mentioned, 2020 po yun. Subsequently, there were a lot of trials which were done latter stage or latter half of 2020. And I will just name a few here highlighting the results because this might impact on how we subsequently view tocilizumab. There's that BACC Bay tocilizumab trial, so done in Boston area. Tocilizumab was seen not to be effective for preventing intubation or death. So again, 2020. But then again, if you're going to look at the TOCI-19 trial, tell us that tocilizumab reduced lethality rate at 30 days compared, let's say, to the standard of care. But this study or this effect was limited to patients not requiring respiratory support at baseline. So again, medyo heterogeneous po yung subject. And then came this Corimuno 19 collaborative group. Again, in a randomized controlled trial fashion, among patients requiring oxygen support, so ito po yung medyo sick, but not admitted to the intensive care unit. So maybe these are the ones who just require, low flow or high flow O2. Siguro hindi po siya intubated. Tocilizumab did not reduce your clinical score, no? But you can see that there was also no difference on day 28 mortality was found. Kaya remember po nung medyo last quarter of 2020, we then questioned the niche of tocilizumab in terms of our clinical pathways. Maybe the signals were mixed to a certain extent, but definitely, tocilizumab was placed at the back seat. But then again, let's segue now to 2021. So still, the frontliner was at the crossroads. Ito po ang storyline natin. Lumabas na yung consensus statements and recommendations. Maganda po yan because this consensus statements framer and crafters of consensus did the review for us. They reviewed everything, they treated everything statistically, epidemiologically, and looked at the hard outcomes. Ano po ba yung sinasabi ng consensus statement? But then again, remember, in some things, there may be conflicting results or conclusion. Bakit sinabi ng ganito consensus may role tong agent? Samantalang yung isa naman, kinokosyon tayo sa paggamit ng ganitong agent. I think that can be explained or reconciled by saying that, remember, the consensus comes from different perspectives. And definitely, once you land at some conclusion, yung perspective po na gusto rin natin tignan is basically, of course, the issue of access availability, considering, of course, the cost of the agent. But remember, you are the clinician at the front line. We are pressured to react well. Diba? Tinatanong po siguro tayo ng hospital natin tulad sa amin ni Dr. Villalobos. Ano ba yung clinical pathway? Saan po natin isisingit yung tocilizumab? Teka lang, magpe-purchase ba ako ng tocilizumab? Sasabihin ng director. Do you have really strong evidence for me to say that it's worth bang? May bang siya for every buck that I will invest. Okay. And therefore, I would like to indulge your audience by revisiting some proof of concept studies. Let's look at studies published and done late 2020 and then published 2021. Possibility of looking at, hey, how is tocilizumab now considering everything? Does that mean that we could not really harp on its touted action? Or is touted action? Do they result to some clinical response or clinical outcomes that we would like to see from the studies? Okay, let's take it from there. One of the landmark trial was this EMPACTA study. EMPACTA study was good because it considered evaluation of tocilizumab among minority patients. No? So they looked at minority patients because they saw from a lot of studies, especially from North America, na napapabayaan yung minority. So they're talking about Latinos, Hispanics, Black Americans, etc. So they randomly assigned in a 2-to-1 fashion hospitalized COVID-19 patients not receiving mechanical ventilation, and they got 1 or 2 doses of tocilizumab at this 8 milligrams per kilogram of body weight intravenously or placebo, and then looking at the primary endpoint of mechanical ventilation or death by day 28. So again, a relevant hard endpoint. Ano po yung sinasabi ng study? Well, let's look at it was statistically significant. In terms of primary outcome of mechanical ventilation or death, if you're going to combine both, those who were given tocilizumab, more than almost 250 of them, fared better compared to placebo. So that's a hard outcome and a hard conclusion. You can see from this graph that it depicted it well, that those again who were given tocilizumab, if you are looking at saving those patients from being intubated, hooked to a mechanical ventilation and death, quite consistently you can see that the effect was quite apparent within the 5 days, and then it was quite well maintained over the 28 days of this study. Let's shift gear, looking at other study, as I mentioned, COVACTA trial. The COVACTA trial was published February to March 2021 in New England Journal of Medicine. So mas latter po siya compared to the IMPACTA study. Again, same, 2:1, and then they received, ito naman, single dose lang ng tocilizumab. And then you can see that still, because this is a non-controlled trial in terms of intervention, approximately 1/4 of the participants received a second dose of tocilizumab 8 to 24 hours after the first dose. Primary outcome was clinical status on an ordinal scale. Ito po yung WHO ordinal scale. Basically, we would like to see low numbers, 1 to 3. That means the patient may be discharged of O2 or at least being stable on low flow O2. Ayaw po natin yung high numbers. 7 means death. Okay, so let's look at the outcome that they've measured. So it was not statistically significant. Looking at the 7 category ordinal scale, those who were given tocilizumab versus placebo. But as you can see from this diagram, mukhang nandun po yung signal. For tocilizumab, ang kanyang range is 1, and then for placebo, 1 to 4. No? So signals are there. If you're going to look at the secondary outcomes, again, the p-value was not statistically significant. Looking at specifically death, days until clinical improvement, and this was the main conclusion of the study. It did not translate to clinical outcomes, but positive trends seems to be there in terms of patients receiving tocilizumab. And let's look at this REMAP-CAP trial. This REMAP-CAP trial was deemed as one of the landmark trials published in April 2021. So as you can see, this REMAP-CAP trial in fact shaped the guidelines subsequently. Remember nung nag-solidarity trial, tapos di po ba ang sinabi doon, tocilizumab has no role? But because of this REMAP-CAP trial, again, tocilizumab found its way into the guidelines on top of the IMPACTA study. So again, adults with COVID-19 within 24 hours, look at that. Their patients are those who were admitted to the ICU, randomly assigned to receive tocilizumab or another IL-6 antagonist, your sarilumab, or standard of care. Standard of care here may, of course, these patients receive dexamethasone because remember, during this time, the recovery trial was already out. The primary outcome was respiratory and cardiovascular organ support 3 days. And again, the ordinal stay looking at specifically hospital death. Okay, so let's look at the study. Mas maganda pong tignan na lang itong graph. So you can see in terms of organ support 3 days, those who were given IL-6 inhibitors, tocilizumab and sarilumab, fared better compared to those who were given control. Again, this was the pooled analysis pag pinagsama po yung dalawa. So quite consistently in terms of a very relevant outcome, organ support 3 days, those who were given tocilizumab and sarilumab fared better compared to those who were not given this IL-6 receptor antagonist. They looked at survival as well, no? So survival. So you can see that ito po yung pagpinold nila, pag pinagsama, no? So as you can see again, although the trends is there, it was not deemed to be really statistically significant in terms of outcome, no? But again, quite consistently, the signal is there in terms of positive outcome with tocilizumab. And therefore, because of this graph, looking at death, looking at organ-free survival, organ-free days, no, organ failure-free days, this REMAP-CAP trial established that yes, tocilizumab has a role. Considering everything, yung mga 2020 studies that I've mentioned, the meta-analysis, the systematic review, and these 3 landmark trials published in a reputable journal like your New England Journal of Medicine, ang sinabi ko nga dito, what do we know so far as of June 23, 2021? Because I'm not claiming that this knowledge will still stick 1 week from now. Ano? It's that rapidly evolving. Well, one, studies are not homogeneous. I've mentioned that medyo heterogeneous po yung patient population. May mga studies looking at patients who just are not requiring O2 oxygen support. But quite consistently, a large chunk of studies looked at patients who required O2 support but did not require mechanical ventilation. I-park po natin yung idea na yan. Patients requiring oxygen support, so I'm looking at low flow, high flow, mga patients on face masks but do not require invasive mechanical ventilation. Sila po yung majority of studies. That means a PF ratio of around between 250 to 200. Okay. Tocilizumab helps in terms of the survival benefits. I've mentioned earlier yung mga studies po. Your EMPACTA, your REMAP-CAP trial, improved oxygenation, and in fact, it prevented intubation. Patient who would benefit the most is still a question mark. Sila po ba yung earlier on na nabibigay ng tocilizumab? There was a good study to tell us that among those who were given the first 2 days, regardless of their oxygen support, benefited the most. If they had low oxygenation, so that means they require oxygen support, especially associated with a hyperinflammatory response. That means your CRP values are way up, your ferritin levels are way up. They may be the ones who would benefit the most. Wag na raw hintayin ma-intubate yung patient. Among those patients in the ICU, that means na-intubate na po sila, mas hindi po nakikita yung response. Remember the COVACTA trial. I fully am aware of a local study done, of course, in Cebu, by, I think, Dr. Aparece, which showed the same benefits in their retrospective analytical study. They have shown that those patients who were given tocilizumab before intubation benefited the most in terms of survival compared to those patients who were given tocilizumab after intubation. So the timing, the question of timing, kailan po ba talaga optimally magbe-benefit ang patient? Signal is there to tell us that if you're going to give tocilizumab, look at the oxygen requirement of your patient. If you're seeing these patients na nag-i-increase yung oxygen requirement coupled with really an inflammatory response based on your biochemical studies, give the tocilizumab. Okay. Another question will be concomitant treatment. As I've mentioned, variable po siya. I've shown you the 2020 study. The 2020 meta-analysis compared po siya sa standard of care. Definitely, some patients receive remdesivir on top of, let's say, your tocilizumab. Pang standard of care, remdesivir nandun, dexamethasone, enoxaparin. So, nangyari po doon with or without tocilizumab. Naiiba siya, depende po sa center and country. And maybe that's yun po ang gusto kong sinasabing sweet spot. Kailan siya ibibigay yung tocilizumab? Ano yung kasama niya para po makita yung maximum benefit? Because if you're looking again on the process, yung ating conceptual framework, you have to hit it at multiple points probably for you to be able to see successfully, resuscitating these patients who have COVID-19. Lastly, the dose. Majority of studies will tell you it is 8 milligrams per kilo per dose, not to exceed 400 milligrams. No? Not to exceed not to exceed 800 milligrams per dose. And therefore, ang madalas pong tanong, if you're going to give them 2 doses, kasi 400 milligrams, tapos di po ba after 8 to 24 hours, or sometimes after 48 to 72 hours, magbibigay ka ulit because still the patients in terms of oxygen requirement, medyo mataas pa rin. You had your repeat labs, medyo mataas pa rin ang inflammatory markers niya, and then magbibigay ka. Ang tanong madalas, ba't hindi pwedeng ikatlo? No? And maybe if you're again going to look at the rationale, remember your inflammatory response or your cytokine storm really is prominent during the second week of illness. So I'm talking about more than 5 days na, and then the cytokine storm may last 7 to 8 days. So during the 5th to possibly 12th or 13th day of illness. So maybe during that time, gusto mo na talaga siya madampen. But remember, you may have contraindications to your tocilizumab, which we will tackle later. And yet, these patients naman naka-steroid. So madalas yun po ang reasoning nating clinician. During this time, okay na yung second dose, maybe you can get away with steroids. Again, still, for me, that's a big question mark. Okay, ito po yung quite consistently na sinasabi ng study. Absolute difference in terms of death. It was able to reduce it by 4%. A powerful conclusion, if you're going to ask. Again, let's now shift gears. Ano ba sinasabi ng recommendation? And this will be quite fast lang po because we are at the latter part of the lecture already. So you can see that quite consistently, the NIH panel as of April 21 this year recommends the use of tocilizumab at 8 milligrams per kilo, no? Maximum of 800 milligrams in combination with dexamethasone in hospitalized patients who exhibits respiratory decompensation due to COVID. And as you can see from this recommendation as well, gusto pa po nila earlier on, no, within the first 3 days of admission, pag doon mo po mahuli yung patient. And those who may require ICU admission, and in fact, who require nga raw invasive mechanical ventilation and other forms of oxygen supplementation. The CRP na cut-off nila is more than 75 milligrams per liter. Again, another guideline, your IDSA guideline, which was, of course, put forward June 3. It has basically the same conclusion that among hospitalized patients with progressively severe, that means oxygen requiring, or critical, that means they necessitate intubation, or the patient is in shock or in ARDS, with elevated markers of systemic inflammation, they do say that you should give tocilizumab in addition to the standard of care, which will include steroids. Again, this is one of the recent guidelines put forward by the Society of Infectious and Tropical Diseases from Italy. Remember, sila po yung nagkaroon ng second or third surge, no, yung Italy. And therefore, they were telling the government, ito po yung pinaka-cost-effective way of dealing with COVID. So you can see that in terms of positioning, they tell you that tocilizumab is there. It should be added on top of your dexamethasone among those patients na tignan mo, invasive or non-invasive mechanical ventilation. So again, may commonality po across yung guidelines. This is the guideline put forward by my department, the Department of Internal Medicine, UPPGH. And as you can see, this was contributed by both, of course, Division of Infectious Diseases and Pulmonary Medicine. Saan po yung tocilizumab? Nandun po siya. So again, yung cut-off po namin is still CRP of 75 milligrams per liter, basta wala pong contraindication. And then, yun po ang recommendation namin na nagbibigay ng tocilizumab. So this was the pathway as well that we recommended to our administration. That's why during the time when tocilizumab was quite challenging to search in the market, ang na-pressure sa amin yung pharmacist namin sa hospital. Okay? Okay, let's look at what the living guidelines is telling us. No, this was again churned out by a group, COVID-19 living document. No, group of clinician epidemiologists spearheaded by PISMID as of June 3, 2021. So you can see tocilizumab is recommended as an addition to systemic steroids in patients showing rapid deterioration and or requiring high doses of oxygen, included po dun yung invasive mechanical ventilation na with elevated markers of inflammation. We recommend against the use of tocilizumab among patients who do not require oxygenation. So as you can see, quite consistently, ang na-identify po ng living guidelines are those who will be requiring oxygen. Mas dinefine pa po nila to subsequently in the guidelines because as you can see from the consensus statement, they issued yung high cost and limited availability. Remember, when you churn out some recommendations from the guidelines, tinitignan mo na rin yung applicability, yung feasibility ng ating recommendation. And that's what's good in terms of living document, no? Kasi nakita nilang maaring hindi siya readily available or maaring, let's say, hindi siya ganun ka-rich in terms of cost, and therefore you have to decide, bibigyan ko ba yung patient or hindi? And as you can see, they really defined, at least the framers of this living document really defined potentially sino po yung patients na magbe-benefit. Just remember the contraindications to tocilizumab. So madalas po tinitignan natin yung AST, ALT, di ba? 5 times yung ayaw namin talaga. Those with thrombocytopenia and those supposedly with uncontrolled, I highlight that, uncontrolled bacterial superinfection. Those with active TB infection or let's say another virus infection like your zoster. So I hope that the last few minutes I was able to share with you the story behind tocilizumab in terms of the rationale behind it, and then anchoring on the rationale behind it, how the literature was at least churned out in terms of studies, looking at the proof beyond this compound, and then subsequently trying to niche it in terms of our guidelines. I would say that at this point as well, marami pa hong unanswered questions, but I think quite consistently the positive message is there. It can have survival benefit. It can possibly protect your patients from being intubated, especially if you're going to combine it with steroid, especially among patients who have hyperinflammatory response as reflected by your inflammatory markers. So that said, thank you very much for your attention, and back to you, Dr. Villalobos.
Hi, sir. So thank you very much, Dr. Benedicto, for your discussion on tocilizumab outcomes and clinical insights. No? So ano lang, Sir Jubert is my partner din sa pag nag-duty kami ng COVID. He's always my partner. So kung ano recommendation ni sir, we also follow that. Actually, we do a group thing in PGH then. So sir, we have a question here. Who can get an antibody treatment? So I think monoclonal antibody treatment, and who should not get? No? So I think this participant is asking if do we have absolute contraindications or indications talaga na for the tocilizumab therapy?
Antibody concoction ba yan? Not necessarily.
I think sir, monoclonal antibody. Baka antibody yung question. Yeah, monoclonal antibody.
Yeah. Leronlimab or yung mga Regeron na concoction. Again, at this particular point in time, I think the living document is saying na wala pa ho siyang role because of the studies are lacking in terms of number and in terms of study design. They could not recommend it to which particular patients who would benefit. There are studies to tell us na yung earlier on, mas maganda siya. So that means those patients na hindi pa ho naglaland sa severe and critical category. So yung mga nagpa-positive pa lang, na dun pa rin lang siguro sa viremic stage, medyo dun yung maganda ang signal ng mga antibody. But having said that, I think we should await further trials po para makita natin yung true niche and then the benefit of antibodies.
Okay, sir. So that's very clear, no? No evidence pa talaga. Next question, sir, here is asking about the timing of tocilizumab naman. So will it be beneficial if you give TOCI at the time where in plasma? So it's talking about the combination of tocilizumab and plasma.
Ano,
So is there
convalescent
any
plasma?
benefit? Yes, sir, convalescent plasma.
There are studies in fact na yung convalescent plasma kasama po siya dun sa naging standard of care, no? So kasi nga sabi ko pa iba-iba yung standard of care doon sa yung sa meta-analysis that I've shown, ano. Some of them had convalescent plasma on top. But remember, for the convalescent plasma po kasi, if you're going to, really dissect this, those who were given convalescent plasma, and I feel na mas magbe-benefit po sila, are those that you capture earlier on. I feel na ganun po yung niche sa convalescent plasma. So that means, let's say by symptomatology, sila po yung nasa 5 to 7 days of illness. Tapos, of course, you may have contraindication for, let's say, giving an antiviral like remdesivir or tocilizumab, possibly. Yun po yung napupunta sa convalescent plasma. Tama ba, Ralph? Ganun yung practice natin, di ba?
Yes, sir. Dati nung yung mga plasma early talaga yung
pero ngayon
very early. Actually, sir, if we base it sa recommendation,
yes,
wala na siya eh.
Wala pa rin, di ba? Wala pa rin. Sa mga studies po na yung sa nag-ask ng question, if you're interested na pinag-combine, hindi po siya quite consistently in terms of timing eh. Why? Because tocilizumab was given, let's say, during the first, let's say, 2 days na bumaba yung oxygen mo. So that means defined as a PF ratio of 250 to 200. So mababa po siya. And then the patient had a inflammatory markers as what was mentioned quite consistently, yung CRP, yung sinitignan nila. Yun po yung binigyan ng tocilizumab, which have shown the benefit na prevent po yung intubation, especially if the patients, let's say, are requiring, tumataas po yung requirement nila ng oxygen support. So within, let's say, first 8 hours, nag-decide yung clinician, binigyan niya. No? As I've mentioned, there was that study done na na-publish sa JAMA na first 2 days wherein the patients were admitted with that PF ratio, binigyan na po nila. Nakita nilang may benefit. I've mentioned the Cebu study. I think that was from Chonghua. Yun naman po ay before intubation. So that means those patients had inflammatory markers na matataas din, requiring oxygen support. Parang halos katulad ng JAMA patient profile. Those who were given tocilizumab benefited in terms of survival benefits naman.
Okay, sir. So talking about, we have the segue kasi the next question actually is asking about inflammatory markers. Now, I think we're nationwide, we're broadcast nationwide, and we know that not all laboratories have the CRP interleukin-6. One audience here is asking po if ferritin can be used as an inflammatory markers, or to generalize the question, what are the useful inflammatory markers for deciding when to give tocilizumab?
That's a very good question. No? If you're going to look at studies quite consistently, they are looking at CRP. No? Yun nga, 75. If you're going to look at interleukin-6, they will just tell you, broad stroke po yung statement. Those patients who have an increased level of interleukin-6, so wala po silang cut-off, wala rin silang sinasabi na twice ka ba elevated, 3 times elevated. They just tell you these are the patients who had poor survival benefit. Kaya nga po, nagkaroon sila ng study na maybe an anti-interleukin-6 will prove beneficial to these patients, considering the profile of these patients earlier on in the pandemic, which was associated with mortality. Having said that, sa mga studies po, 75 yung cut-off ng CRP. Ngayon, pag tinanong mo ko, anong translation po niyan pag ferritin naman yung pinag-uusapan? I think, correct me Ralph, pero may mga studies na 500 ba yung cut-off? Tama ba yung recollection ko? Na parang ganun, ano?
Iba-iba, sir eh.
Oo, iba-iba.
Pero hindi standard, sir.
Oo, pero ang ibang study, parang yun yung partnership nila. 75 and a
Very good.
ferritin na mga more than 500, yun po, concomitant, pwede na po magbigay. But having said that, alam ko naman sa ibang patients, di ba, there was a time, Ralph, hindi naging available yung inflammatory marker sa PGH, di ba? Nagkaroon
Yes,
ng,
sir.
syempre magulo yan sa atin, nagkaroon ng problema sa reagents and everything. So I think we did clinical. Parang ang point lang natin, yung mga patients na yung PF ratio bumabagsak, tapos nakakakita tayo ng ground glass galore dun sa chest imaging study. Tapos wala namang contraindication, di naman mataas yung AST, ALT niya. Yun po, binigyan namin. No, binigyan namin. But if you're going to ask us, is that quite consistently studied na maganda po yung association? Wala po siyang formal study. But if you're going to look at the conceptual framework, that the one that I've shown earlier on, di po ba yung progress ng COVID-19, it will really tell you that during the hyperinflammatory phase, ano po yung makikita mo dun sa patient? Dun sila talagang hirap huminga, no? Dun silang bumabagsak yung oxygenation. They will need supplemental oxygen na escalating. So maybe those are clinical parameters that tell us, oy, during this time, grabbing inflammatory phase, and maybe tocilizumab will be of benefit there, despite, let's say, that you are not anchoring your decision on inflammatory markers. I mean, actual inflammatory marker value.
Yes, sir. I think we have another question about adverse effects naman, sir, or caution in patients with tocilizumab. So, can we administer TOCI in patients with decompensated liver disease? I think may history of liver disease na decompensated.
Ikaw, Ralph, anong experience mo?
Sir, actually,
ka ba sa contraindication?
No, sir. Actually, it's, COVID talaga, siya. Timpla-timpla siya if you think that it will benefit the patient, I even had some patients na active hepatitis, binigyan ng tocilizumab because we think magbe-benefit talaga siya. In the brink na talaga siya of cytokine storm, so bibigyan mo ng tocilizumab. You just watch out for the adverse effects. Kasi sabi nga nila, papatayin pa siya ng COVID first before he will, decompensate with the liver disease. Tama ba, sir? Ganun din ba yung ginagawa?
Dun sa COVID-19 guidelines, as what I've showed you, that's why I showed it during my last slide. Ang usual talagang mark nila, or at least cut off 5 times elevated na ALT, no? Na medyo no-no, or sinasabi sa'yo, oy, not naman an outright contraindication, pero na maging cautious ka na, or you have an active TB. Remember, Ralph, meron tayong COVID and TB na co-infection. Nag-hesitate magbigay yung ID, di ba? Tayong pulmo yung makulit, no? Na go, go, go. Pero tayo ang kinokosyon. Or let's say those patients na may thrombocytopenia less than 100,000, talagang takot na takot sila magbigay. But remember the diagram that I've shown you from the New England Journal of Medicine regarding cytokine storm, yung may body ng tao. Remember that the cytokine storm, umaapaw po within, it does not respect boundaries or anatomic boundaries. The inflammatory condition is seen in general sa buong katawan ng pasyente. And therefore, what we are saying is that the transaminitis that we are seeing, yung mga elevated transaminases, may be a form of COVID hepatitis, no? So sometimes, yun po yung alam kong hindi comfortable lahat ng clinician. But if you're going to tell me, yun na nga, sabi ni Ralph, depende dun saan mo siya nahuli, yung pasyente, sa clinical course niya. So convince ka, dito sa phase na to, papasok talaga yung cytokine storm or impending storm. Uy, tumataas yung oxygen requirement ng pasyente. Uy, mataas lang ang liver function test. Pero, not naman ecteric yung patient. Pwede mong bigyan, tapos cautiously monitor the patient. But of course, dapat mag-consent yung patient, or caregiver, for them to know that what you're thinking is that this is part of COVID. I will give an interventional regimen, but hoping that, based on the rationale behind the drug, it should work.
Yeah. Yes, sir. So I think yun yung importante, yung talking to the patient, getting consent, and explaining talaga yung mga adverse effects. Is TOCI safe for pregnant and lactating mothers, and how about pediatric patients?
Okay, ikaw, Ralph.
I have no
Pregnant.
experience
Alam ko,
giving. Actually, sir, we have
meron tayo, di
cases
ba?
na
Oo.
nag-TOCI. Yes,
Mga
sir.
dalawa ba yun
Yes, sir.
sila?
Dalawa sa
Pero
ICU.
ano yun,
Tatlo,
ang
sir.
tagal ng discussion na yun with the husband, remember? To be
Matagal
honest po kasi, hindi po siya nagsasabi na 100% safe siya.
Mhm.
I agree with Ralph, we encountered that challenging scenario kasi pregnant, tapos talagang obvious naman na COVID si mother. And ground glass appearance, tapos nag-positive yung RT-PCR. We just have to talk to the husband. Hindi ko na matandaan, Ralph, kung ano naging outcome nun eh.
Survivor, sir. I think
Di ba?
to
Yun yung
survive
na-ICU.
sa
Oo, di ba
ICU,
na-high flow yun?
na-prone pa.
Natatanda ko yun. Na-prone pa, naka-high flow. Tapos may isa pa tayong patient na buntis na ayaw niya magpa-prone kasi nga buntis. Naka-high flow, nabigyan din po ng tocilizumab yun. Napauwi yun. So, we're not saying that it's 100% safe. What we're saying is that if you think the risk the benefit is really outweighs the risk considering, syempre, ikaw nakakakita dun sa patient and considering the promise of the drug, it might be worth a try. Yung sa PEDYA, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not too sure if our PEDYA colleagues are using it. Kasi alam ko, nagre-remdesivir yung PEDYA kasi pag nagpapaalam, di ba? I'm not too sure for tocilizumab, to be honest. Because the studies that I've shown you are adults, let me clarify that. Adults po sila. So that means 18 years old and above. Wala po akong masyadong nakitang landmark study na PEDYA age group.
Okay, sir. So, this one question here is, okay lang daw ba umabot ng 3 days ang paggamit ng TOCI with dose of 600 milligrams OD?
Wow, 600 milligrams OD. Oh, kasi 8 milligrams per kilo siya, no? Tapos 800 milligrams maximum. Okay, there are no studies to tell us na no beyond the 2 doses. What do the studies tell us? Ang masasabi lang po ng study, you're going to give the first dose, tapos you have to decide within 48 hours if you're going to give the second dose. Yun po yung nakikita nilang may benefit. Kung magbibigay ka na rin, magbigay ka nga earlier on, ano? Now, madalas po sa studies, they will tell you if it will work, it should work, let's say, within 48 to 72 hours of you giving the drug. So, madalas po talaga, pag nagbigay ka ngayon, minomonitor mo yung patient within 24 to 48 hours, tapos nagde-decide ka after 48 hours, teka, bigay pa nga tayo ng isa kung sakasakali. Yes, I agree with you that sometimes bitin po yung 2 doses. Unfortunately, the landmark trials restricted it to just 2 doses. But wala naman po akong nag-come across that inhibits you from giving beyond the 2 doses. Ang masasabi ko lang po siguro kasi if you're going to go again the pathophysiology and the timeline ng cytokine storm, remember that usually po talaga 7 days siyang kumbaga, the patient has to go through that hyperinflammatory phase for 7 days. You're just hoping that with your intervention, madadampen mo yung cytokine storm na gino-go through ng patient or you can calm it. But remember, still, the patient has to go through that stormy phase before he or she gets better. So, kung 7 days po yun, kung nagbigay tayo during sa day 0, tapos nagbigay ka ng isa pa, yes, the possibility is there that you may still have some benefit if you're going to give it another dose or the 3rd dose. But I did not come across any studies to document if really that translates to clinical benefits.
Okay, sir. So I think we're down to question number 7, one of the last few questions. So which one is beneficial to give first? No, or which one is beneficial to give first? Is it TOCI or REMDE, or you give it both? Or I don't know if kung ano sir yung inano ninyo, usually in practice.
Sabay-sabay tayo, Ralph, di ba? Siyempre, steroids, nandun na talaga yung steroids. We are quite convinced with the recovery results, and I think quite consistently across guidelines, talagang standard of care, steroids and thromboprophylaxis. no? So nandun po yung steroid. So we are assuming that the steroid is there. Ngayon kung ano pong mauuna, remdesivir or tocilizumab, again, based on our experience po talaga, remdesivir, we are reserving it among those who will require, as of now po kasi ang sinasabi ng studies, low flow O2 yung pinakamagandang benefit niya. No? So those patients who needs O2 support pero hindi pa po siya na i-intubate and everything, yes, remdesivir may work, especially pag sa timelines mo, nahuhuli mo yung patient during the viremic stage, no? And then the tocilizumab, medyo, I would advise na siguro mababa lang yung threshold mo na the possibility once your inflammatory markers is going haywire that, you know, you are open to trying this agent. Yes, ang mahirap lang po talaga kung pagsasabayin nyo sila, kawawa liver nyo. Ralph, ano nga bang ginagawa natin? Inuuna pa natin remdesivir or tocilizumab sa PGH?
Depende yan talaga, sir. Kung ako usually, sir, tayo sa team natin, usually sabay yan kung toxic na toxic talaga. Or kunyari, we think na magto-toxic siya in the next few days, sinasabay na natin. Baga wala na. Because we have the liberty nga, or the availability nga siguro talaga, sir, ng remdesivir or toxic. But ako, sir, personally, mukhang mas doon ako nagpa-prioritize ng TOCI kapag really indicated na talaga yung tocilizumab. Kasi the effect of tocilizumab actually, kita agad siya eh. Kasi within, tama kayo, sir, 24 to 48 hours, you will know that nag-effect talaga yung TOCI. Yung remde, nandyan lang siya. And then the side effects naman wise, wala. Pareho naman silang halos safe din to give.
Kasi minsan, I
usually,
think
sir,
baka yun baka kasi nag-question. Kasi di ba pag ino-order mo sa chart, ang pinibigay ba natin, tocilizumab tayo first eh, di ba? Yung in-order mo sa chart, di ba? Tapos parang kumbaga, yung remdesivir, baka bukas mo na maibigay, ganyan, di ba? Kasi nga, I fully agree with you because hinahabol po talaga natin yung madampen yung inflammatory response ng patient, knowing fully well that it is the inflammatory response which is consistently associated with catastrophic outcomes.
Yeah. Second to the last question, sir. In end-stage renal disease, is there a study on the use of TOCI or do you recommend TOCI for end-stage renal disease patients?
Ano po yan madalas? Argument with our nephrologist, no? So, wala pong study clear-cut to tell us na ang end-stage renal disease, tocilizumab, as what I've shown you, madalas po liver talaga yung cautious natin, no? Yung caution. No? We tend to discuss it with the renal kasi madalas yung mga kidney diseases namin, yun po yung mga na hihemo-perfuse na rin kung hindi man lang nadadialysis, no? So nag-hope kami na by that intervention, you know, the inflammation will be reduced again. So ako po personally, siguro kung bibigyan ko siya, ayun lang po ang back ng mind ko. Dahil may indication as evidenced by a really inflammatory markers that are really elevated and that the patient is requiring escalating doses of oxygen. And then I have to discuss it with my nephrologist at that point.
Okay, thank you, sir. Ito last question, I think very relevant question. No? Madaming discussion dito eh. So, can one receive a COVID-19 vaccine? Ito naman, vaccine if already treated with monoclonal antibodies for COVID-19.
Ano po kasi siya? Ang pagkakaalam ko po, ang sinabi ni Dr. Alejandria, yung nag-frame, isa sa mga nag-frame ng living COVID document, wala po siyang contraindication. They could receive, no? So ang rule lang po talaga raw parate is that once the patient is deemed recovered, 2 weeks po after siya mag-deemed recovered. So kung na, you know, yung 21 days ng isolation, isama nyo na doon. Basta nagsabi na, let's say, by this time you are deemed recovered. 2 weeks po after that, they can receive the vaccine.
Ano tayo, sir? Ang engaging ng audience natin. Pahabol na question. Can you give TOCI on patients with concomitant pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia, especially those with elevated WBC?
Yeah, yan yung isa sa caution. And then, siguro Ralph, alam mo yan yung discussion natin parati sa IT, di ba? Na hold back sa atin usually, di ba? Nagsasabi tayo na hindi, inflammatory response pa rin to dahil sa COVID, so bigyan na natin. Pero sabi nga raw nila, as what I've shown you, no, pag may super infection na bacterial infection, nakalagay siya dun sa contraindication sa COVID, living COVID document. Pero ako po, coming from a pulmonologist, and I don't know about Ralph as well, ako po kasi talagang bibigyan ko na lang siya as long as we are covering for the bacterial pneumonia. Wala naman pong argument. Ito pong mga COVID-19 patients are quite prone with secondary bacterial infection. But then again, remember, yung inflammatory response nyo, dire-diretso pa rin naman yan no, na na-incite ng COVID unless na ma-halt nyo nga yung link somewhere. So kung ako po, as long as the patient is receiving good antibiotic coverage, I will be more courageous in terms of giving tocilizumab.
So, yes, sir. Thank you very much. That's the last question. Very engaging and insightful tonight. Before we end the open forum, I would like to ask you for any final message.
Final message po siguro, ang pinaka-important na message is let's always look at the guidelines, and then of course the way studies are panning out. As I've mentioned, maaring ito pong nililecture natin ngayon, 2 weeks from now, 1 week from now, maiba na naman. Let's be open to changes. Looking at, basta properly appraise lang po natin yung literature, because I know that at the end of the day, you are at the front lines. Kayo po ang mag-a-answer dun sa patient. Kayo po ang mag-a-answer sa inyong administration or hospital. So that means hopefully our decision will be science-driven and of course based on data and of course based on experiences. That's why I really cherish these moments wherein we share each other's views. Good evening, everyone.
So thank you, Sir Joubert, for that very insightful and engaging talk. So thank you for answering the questions of our colleagues. So good evening, everyone. So now I will now turn you over to the virtual floor to the Product and Sales Manager of Biocare, Mr. Michael Christian Pere and Mark De Vera for the next segment. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Joubert, and thank you, Dr. Ralph. And good evening, doctors. After that very informative scientific lecture, allow us this moment to rest, let your brain matter relax, and have some enjoyment. We will have a game that will allow you to win a COVID essential item. I will ask a question which will be shown on the screen. All you have to do is write your answer on the question box. We will give you 10 seconds to key in your answer. The first person to send in the correct answer for each question will receive a UVC lamp. Okay. For multiple choice questions, answer the letter of your choice. Just a reminder to write your answer on the question box.
All right, doctors, are you ready? May I have the first question, please? Biocare brands of tocilizumab, Temsiba, is available in what preparation? A, 80 mg concentrate solution for IV infusion. Letter B, 162 mg concentrate solution for IV infusion. 200 mg, letter C, 200 mg concentrate solution for IV infusion. And letter D, 400 mg concentrate solution for IV infusion. Timer starts now. Time is up, and the correct answer is letter D, 400 mg concentrate solution for IV infusion. And the first person to get the correct answer is Dr. Rodora Lani. Congratulations, Dr. You've won one UVC. Okay, may I have the second question, please? How long should you quarantine if you are exposed to someone with COVID-19 after you've been vaccinated? Letter A, 0 days. Letter B, 10 days. Letter C, 14 days. Or letter D, until you receive a negative test result. Timer starts now. Time is up. Let's show the audience the correct answer. Letter A, 0 days. According to CDC, vaccinated people do not need to quarantine or get tested if they are been around with someone who has COVID-19, as long as you don't develop any symptoms. Okay, the first person to get the correct answer is Doctora Floriter Agustin. Congratulations, Doctora. You've won one UV slot. Congratulations, Doctora. And now, may I ask for the third question? Which of the following statement on tocilizumab is true? Letter A, tocilizumab is a recombinant humanized monoclonal antibody that inhibits binding of interleukin-5 to both membrane and soluble interleukin-6 receptor. Letter B, tocilizumab is a recombinant humanized monoclonal antibody that inhibits binding of interleukin-6 to both membrane and soluble interleukin-6 receptor. Or letter C, tocilizumab is a recombinant humanized monoclonal antibody that inhibits binding of interleukin-6 to both membrane and soluble interleukin-5 receptors. And letter D, tocilizumab is a recombinant humanized monoclonal antibody that inhibits binding of interleukin-7 to both membrane and soluble interleukin-6 receptor. Timer starts now. Time is up. Let's show the audience the correct answer. Letter B, tocilizumab is a recombinant humanized monoclonal antibody that inhibits binding of interleukin-6 to both membrane and soluble interleukin-6 receptors. So the first person to get the correct answer is Dr. Parafina. Congratulations. Over to you, Sir Mike.
Thank you, Sir Mark. And we still have two more questions. May I have the next question, please? The recommended dose for tocilizumab for COVID-19 is letter A, 8 milligram per kilogram, and total dose must not exceed at 400 milligram. Letter B, 404 milligram per kilogram, and total dose must not exceed at 800 milligram. Letter C, 800 milligram per kilogram, and total dose must not exceed at 800 milligram. Letter D, 8 milligram per kilogram, and total dose must not exceed at 400 milligram. Timer starts now. The correct answer is letter C. The recommended dose is 8 milligram per kilogram administered intravenously with 0.9% sodium chloride over 1 hour and as a single dose. The total dose of tocilizumab must not exceed at 800 milligrams. Tocilizumab must not be infused concomitantly in the same IV line with other medications. So the first person to get the correct answer is Dr. Michael Roger Mondala. Congratulations, Doctor. And now, we're down to our last question. Aside from Temsiva, tocilizumab, Biocare Lifesciences also marketed other COVID products. Letter A, remdesivir. Letter B, favipiravir. Letter C, interferon beta-1 alpha. Or letter D, all of the above. Timer starts now. And the correct answer is letter D. And the first person who sent the correct answer is Dr. Jaya Roque. Congratulations, Dr. Jaya.
Congratulations, doctors. Hi. Sir Mike.
Yes, sir.
Congratulations, doctors. May we request for all the winners to write their name and address to the question box in order for the token to be delivered to you. Sir Mike?
With that, let me call on our business unit head for Biocare Life Sciences, Mr. Ronald Palacio.
Thank you, Mike and Mark. So it was truly a very enriching night learning from our experts who shared with us clinical insight on the use of tocilizumab in the treatment of coronavirus disease. On behalf of Biocare Life Sciences Incorporated, I would like to thank Dr. Jubert Benedicto, our speaker, and our moderator, Dr. Raul Villalobos, for gracing this forum. Thank you, Dr. Jubert and Dr. Raul. Temsiba is approved as a drug product for emergency use by Philippine FDA. SRS Life Sciences holds the registration of tocilizumab in the Philippines, while Argen produced the therapy. Ariogen PharmaMed is a EU GMP approved facilities located in Iran, established in 2011 by a well-experienced scientist. Today, we are grateful for the opportunity to initially distribute Temsiba in over 200 hospitals in the country. As the cases of COVID-19 continuously increasing, and with the availability of Temsiba, Biocare brand of tocilizumab, and with hopefully this life-saving medicine will help our patients save and improve the quality of life. Again, our gratitude as well to you all, our dear doctors and healthcare partners, for choosing to attend tonight's scientific talk, and to our partner agency, MedConcept, for organizing this webinar. At this juncture, we would like to request our participant to answer a brief survey before you leave the meeting. On the screen is a QR code and link. Please scan the QR code and type the link on your browser, whether it's Google or Safari, and begin answering the survey. Once you have accomplished the survey, you will automatically receive your e-certificate, which you can download. You will also receive a copy of your e-certificate in your email. The survey is open from 7 to 11 p.m. only. Don't forget to accomplish the post-webinar survey form so as to facilitate your certificate of attendance. Once again, thank you to doctors for spending the night with us. Stay safe, everyone, and good night. Thank you.
Biocare Lifesciences Incorporated is a pharmaceutical company engaged in the distribution, importation, registration, and marketing of various therapeutic products across the Philippines. We at Biocare commit ourselves to service excellence in the promotion and delivery of essential as well as technologically advanced medical products that are within reach of the average Filipino. We pride ourselves in our company core values: punctuality, integrity, commitment, accountability, and this reflects on our service. Our vision is to play a significant role among the pharmaceutical companies in the Philippines, delivering high-quality yet affordable products and services that improve the quality of the Filipino lives it touches. We are dedicated to our mission to be among the top market leaders in our chosen segments by providing qualitative and affordable medicines to the community and year-to-year growth of employees and stakeholders, as well as to develop a young, talented, and experienced workforce. In 2011, Biocare Life Sciences Incorporated was founded by Managing Director Dilip Tiwari and President Kimberly Chua Tiwari. By 2012, we started the distribution of our products to numerous multinational and national companies. In 2013, Biocare registered over 23 products for different segments, and by 2015, we expanded our staff, deploying our new sales force to 17 areas in Central Luzon, South Luzon, and the Visayas region. In 2016, the expansion of the sales force and marketing team continues to the Greater Manila area, Visayas, and North Luzon, and we've moved to the new HQ with a complete rebrand. By 2017, we successfully launched Cefsul, a combination of third-generation cephalosporins and beta-lactamase inhibitor antibiotic. Now, Biocare expands to Cambodia and launched our first inhaler line with salmeterol fluticasone, Salflosol MDI, and Highcare, brand of salbutamol. Biocare has products from reputed pharmaceutical manufacturers around the world whose facilities are approved by various regulatory boards. And Biocare hasn't even reached its full potential. In 7 years, we've only laid a foundation. Soon, we'll strengthen our reach to the Mindanao region and eventually spread to the whole Asia-Pacific region with a culture of leadership and accountability. Looking forward, we want Biocare to be a corporation that you can always trust. Providing quality, defining life.
ending webinar in 3, 2, 1.